Thanks, everyone. So this is sort of transportation engineering. It's not really. It's probably more transportation modeling and policy analysis. But as Jen said, and as you can see from the slide, what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is some results that have come out of a long study, a large study, mostly in terms of effort, not necessarily in terms of funding, but having to do with environmental and health impacts of landside freight transportation. I'll explain more about that as we get into it. In the Alameda corridor, and when I say Alameda corridor, I'm speaking in the broadest sense, not just the rail line, which was the original, I guess, entity that was, for which the term Alameda corridor was coined, but about a probably 200 square mile area, about 10 miles wide by 20 miles long from the ports up to the Commerce rail yard around downtown. A large team effort. This is probably the majority. There were a few others who had minor roles, but the majority of our researchers. So far, this project has generated, I guess, 3 PhDs. Gunwoo Lee at the top there is now back in Korea at the Korea Maritime Institute. Iris Yu is a project scientist at ITS. Mana Senka-Pichai is at SCAG. Kate Hyun is a current PhD student, and faculty colleagues, Jean-Daniel Safaras is a transportation engineer and economist. J. Krishnan is an expert in network analysis and simulation, and Dali Ogun-Seaton chairs UCI's Department of Population Health and Disease Prevention, so he's a public health person. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Eric Shen and his staff. I'm sure some of you know that group at the Port of Long Beach. They've been terrific help to us. This is the outline of what I thought that I would cover. It's probably too ambitious. I might skip over some things as we go through it, but this is what I would like to cover. So let me digress for a little bit. About 5 or 6 years ago, I was in a meeting. I don't remember where it was. I think it might have been at TRB, and there was a speaker talking about health impacts in the Alameda corridor, and mentioned something like air quality impacts cause about 2,000 deaths, 2,000 deaths a year in the Alameda corridor. I heard this, and I guess it's a reflection of my ignorance or naivety at the time. I was just flabbergasted. This was a system, if you think of the whole corridor, the roads, the freeways, traffic signals, the rail lines, the whole thing. This is a system transportation engineers and planners have built, right? And actually, are there any civil engineers here in the audience? Are you members of ASC, student members? Are there any planners who are members of a student chapter of APA? No? Okay. If you look in the Code of Ethics, ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers, has a Code of Ethics. If you look in the Code of Ethics, which I did last night, a fundamental canon of the ASCE Code of Ethics says, engineers shall hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. Safety, health, and welfare. If you look at the APA website and under AICP, American Institute of Certified Planners, I guess, the very first principle in the Code of Ethics says our primary obligation is to serve the public interest. Serving the public interest, preserving and enhancing public safety, welfare, and health. And yet this system that we've designed is killing maybe not 2,000 people, but probably in the hundreds of people a year. I was just flabbergasted when I learnt this, and when I checked into it, there was some credibility to the claims, and this was, for me, something of an epiphany, and this is why I actually wrote this proposal, or the very first proposal here about 5 or 6 years ago, which led to this study, thinking that we could maybe do something to alleviate the situation. Well, fortunately, there were a lot of other people smarter than me, with more influence than me in our group, who had thought about this long before us and had created a number of mitigation strategies that we'll talk a little bit about today, one of those being the Clean Trucks program, which has now been implemented. But the system that I'm going to describe, this modeling system, is one that at least can analytically determine the magnitude of the impacts, the benefits, not just in sort of general terms or by taking surveys at the side of the road, which has its own value, but in terms of modeling the whole corridor and trying to get a handle on the magnitude of the impacts in terms of costs, admittedly imputing dollar values to human life and suffering, which is part of what EPA and the federal government does, and we often do in cost-benefit analysis. In any event, you probably know the San Pedro Bay ports, which is this dual port complex of LA and Long Beach, is one of the largest in the world. It's fifth busiest, or it was, prior to the recession. Processes just an astronomical number of containers, 40% of the US container trade. Some of those, of course, are headed to California, but they go across the country as well. A lot of revenue generation for taxes, a lot of jobs in the port area, in the warehousing logistics area, in the Inland Empire. Containers, you may know, are classified in terms of 20-foot equivalent units. So international shipping containers tend to be 20 feet or 40 feet, so a 40-foot container is 2 TEUs. And the TEUs going through the ports now are back to about 2005 levels, more or less. But if you look at the growth, which was part of the controversy that in the last 10 years associated with the ports, there's just phenomenal growth. Just Long Beach had a 60% increase in containers between 2000 and 2007. So the ports were growing, the container trade was booming. But the benefits from the ports and their expansion, particularly the expansion issue, were threatened by the traffic congestion. We know about the 710 and in the ports area in particular, and the air pollution. And the air pollution affects public health, especially for the local communities, which they're well aware of. And those local communities are believed to bear a disproportionate burden of those health impacts. And what are these impacts? They're things like respiratory disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and premature death. And these occur largely due to what's called PM, particulate matter emissions, which is a byproduct of combustion from diesel engines used in diesel trucks and diesel powered trains, and also NOx, nitrous oxides, which are harmful to health and cause asthma and so on. So a major concern in the corridor is PM emissions, and these particles have medically been proven. They're only like 2.5 microns. They're so tiny that they actually enter the bloodstream and stay in our bodies. So that's not really a debatable issue, I guess, that medical science has shown that the effect of PM on human health and so forth. So a lot of this PM came from diesel trucks using the roads and facilities in the vicinity of the ports, and both freeways and surface streets carrying port cargo, mostly containers, to and from the ports, to the intermodal rail yards that are in the vicinity, to transloading facilities in the vicinity. And then there are also trains that use the Alameda corridor, a fantastic engineering feat, the Alameda corridor, 20 miles from the ports to LA, a lot of it below grade. But nevertheless, those trains are generating a lot of PM as well. Some of the additional driving concerns for the ports with respect to emissions are AB 32. You probably know about that, I imagine, the Global Warming Solutions Act, still in effect in California, state law to reduce greenhouse gas emissions back to 1990 levels. Air Resources Board is the responsible state agency for enforcing that. We're actually starting to do a lot of work with ARB now. SB 375, that Professor Bournette here has been working on too, implementing land use and transportation planning changes to reduce VMT and so on and so forth. Our study addresses these issues. How severe is the traffic congestion and the air pollution associated with the ports? Severe meaning in a quantitative sense, hopefully. Can the Clean Trucks program and cleaner locomotives, which are mandated by the federal EPA, alleviate those externalities? and how can one evaluate the air quality impacts of like Clean Trucks program and other alternatives. Another bullet, which isn't actually shown here, is the whole environmental justice issue, which if there's time I'll just touch on today. But it's really an equity issue as to who's benefiting and who's paying. You know, for middle class, affluent Southern Californians who live nowhere near the ports, when we get our Amazon deliveries, free shipping, no tax, that's fantastic, right? Everything's great with the world. What's wrong with the freight system? Well, I'd suggest that we're actually not paying the full cost of those goods, because there are costs. Those imported goods, iPods that are coming in from China through the ports and other electronic things and so forth, are part of this stream of goods going through the Alameda corridor, most likely, and generating these externalities and costs. So there is an environmental justice and an equity issue associated with this. But today I'm going to describe this integrated modeling approach that we've developed to address air quality and health benefits on freeways, surface streets, and rail. So this is the corridor. We're up here somewhere, so we're actually in the corridor. But the ports area, LA and Long Beach is here. 710, I'm not sure if you can see it from the back, 710 is on the right-hand side, 110 is here. It includes SR 91, the 105 freeway, I-5 to the north, and the 10 freeway. This is a massive undertaking to try to model a transportation system and a highway network of this magnitude. So particularly when one tries to address surface streets and to simulate traffic on surface streets, and to do it microscopically, as I'll discuss in a moment. So we basically included surface streets up to about the 91 here, which are the main ones we felt that trucks were traveling on. Part of the problem is that the data is really limited for a study like this. You can get freeway data, volumes and so forth. Even that is a little bit sketchy. Caltrans has a system called PEMS that some of you may know about, the Freeway Performance Management System, I think it is. But on the surface streets, there's almost nothing there. LADOT has some information, but some of these signals are in non-LA areas. So we actually had some students out measuring signal timings down here, and traffic volumes, a little bit of that, but data's very sketchy for the surface streets, and trying to get data on the rail system is next to impossible. The railroads don't like to share data. It's very difficult to get, especially anything to do with environmental impacts. There's huge sensitivity. Okay, number of rail yards you can see here. ICTF is a big one, intermodal container transfer facility, and the Commerce Yard, you've probably driven past it, up here is a huge facility where containers go from trucks to trains. When we began the study, CARB and SCAG and the ports had proposed a number of strategies for reducing air pollution. These basically include strategies that evolved into the Clean Trucks program. They had, and consultants had, evaluated some of these strategies using so-called macroscopic models. And I'm going to distinguish repeatedly between macroscopic models and microscopic models, which, as the name implies, the micro are much more detailed. California has a model called MFAC, which is a very well-known model. And actually, one of my PhD students is probably going to start working for AIB recoding MFAC pretty soon. But it's a macroscopic model, and the problem is, from our perspective, is that these models can't capture very detailed interactions due to traffic congestion, stop-and-go traffic, traffic operations strategies, and they do not address individual vehicle accelerations, decelerations. These kinds of profiles, speed profiles of vehicles and accelerations, decelerations, are very heavily responsible for the emissions that are generated by trucks. So if you ignore this and you make changes to the system that affect accelerations and decelerations while you keep the speeds the same, macroscopic models are going to say there's no change in emissions, when in reality there's been potentially a huge change. So for that reason, we utilized a microscopic simulation model. A particular model was Transmodeler, which is by Caliper Corporation. interfaces with a planning package called Transcad and has a much nicer, easier interface to use for coding the network. There have been some recent studies, or there were some recent studies at the time we started this, particularly for the 710 corridor, but these basically examined emissions while it was at a microscopic level. They were very limited in scope, didn't consider things like cleaner engines, different fuels, effects of shifting containers to rail, which we've looked at, but I won't be reporting on that today, and did not consider the corridor-wide dispersion. And the dispersion of the pollutants through the corridor is a big issue, and most studies have only looked maybe at the adjacent area, a quarter mile next to the freeway or to the arterial streets. Okay, we've examined a number of scenarios, but today I'm going to limit the discussion to 3, and hopefully I'll have time to get through that. The 3 scenarios are a baseline scenario, which is the ports as they were operating in 2005. The reason for 2005 is that that's a year that many other studies have utilized. For instance, the Air Resources Board in their emissions reduction plan for the ports and goods movement in California used 2005. There's a lot of other data that were collected for 2005. Another reason was to basically isolate the impacts of the Clean Trucks program, which was implemented after 2005, and also to insulate us from other programs like Peer Pass and, of course, the recession. So after a lot of analysis, we basically chose one day, March 9th, 2005, to represent typical traffic conditions. Typical, but no incidents on that day. So given the frequency of incidents on the 710, it probably underestimates congestion. This was at a time back in 2005 before the ports extended their hours, so I think they were operating then from 8 to 6. And so our simulation period, we did an hour before and an hour after, so we went from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And so that's the 2005 baseline. Then there are 2 other scenarios that were examined that relate to clean trucks and clean locomotives. What I will call year 2010 or scenario 2010 and year 2012. 2010 is when the ports banned the old polluting, the dirty trucks, and the EPA required use of more or cleaner Tier 2 locomotives. And in 2012, basically it's full implementation of Clean Trucks program and use of Tier 3 locomotives. So some of you may know about the Clean Truck program. It was a joint project, is a joint project of the ports, utilized public funds from Prop 1B to assist truck owners to replace their older polluting drayage trucks. There were 3 phases. We're interested in 2010 and 2012 here. Part of the deal was if you took public money, you had to agree to put an RFID tag in your truck, and you had to agree to tracking via GPS. So a lot of truck owners actually didn't do it. A lot of the private companies paid for that themselves. We don't really know why, but we think probably because they didn't want to be tracked. But public monies were used, and there is a database that includes the GPS tracks of all those trucks that actually were publicly funded. And then the clean locomotives, the EPA introduced these regulations for cleaner locomotives. They call them Tier 2 and Tier 3. So they're the 3 scenarios: the baseline 2005, 2010, which is sort of interim implementation of clean trucks, and 2012, full implementation along with cleaner locomotives to boot. So our study basically estimates the changes in air pollutant emissions from the port trucks and the rail activity in the corridor that reflects these mandated changes, the fleet changes in clean trucks, locomotive changes, so that when we're simulating sort of before and after, but by focusing on 2005, we can use the simulation results from the before case as the same results for the after case. All we have to do is basically change the emission rates. We change the engine or the emission characteristics of the trucks, and we don't have to do the simulation all over again for the after case. This is a huge advantage because the simulation for a corridor of this size is an absolutely massive undertaking. If any of you have done any traffic simulation, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, you just have to trust me, I guess. It's a massive undertaking. It's very computationally intensive. This is our study framework. We utilized 4 tools, this so-called integrated suite of models. The last 3, MOVES, CalPUF, and BenMap, are either EPA models or EPA recommended tools. We estimated emissions on highways and rail separately, then we combined them in the combined analysis at the end. How do you get started? Well, you need a network. We obtained a SCAG. It was a planning network to begin with. Then we used Transcad. You have to do sub-area analysis because this one is much too crude, much too aggregate, and generate a seed matrix. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this, but we did dynamic OD estimation. Basically, every 15 minutes, we tried to replicate the observed traffic volumes that we had. So there's very sophisticated dynamic OD estimation underlying this whole simulation. And to our knowledge, it's probably the largest dynamic OD estimation ever conducted for an urban network. So, and my colleagues, Jay Krishnan and PhD students, are especially heavily involved in that. But the network has something like 1,800 links and 1,400 nodes. So it's big. I'll just speak really briefly to this. The GEH is a statistic that traffic simulation people focus on. It's like a modified chi-squared statistic, so it measures goodness of fit between what you've simulated and what you observed. So you want goodness of fit the best you can get, right? So when you simulate, you want your simulated volumes to be close to the observed volumes so that you can believe your results. If you're doing very detailed analyses, you want GHH to be less than 5 for probably at least 85% of the links. For a study like ours, where we're not actually doing that sort of local design and analysis, we're doing large area analysis, these are appropriate criteria, and these were met. And remember, we're doing this for every 15 minutes during the day. We started out, if you've done any simulation, you may know that usually when it's a stochastic process, you try to do a large number of runs, typically 30 runs, use the central limit theorem if you know some of the stats and probability. It turns out that in models like this, there's not a lot of stochastic variation, and although you would think that you should do a large number of runs, you can actually do one run, and we've tested this, and even doing one run, the runs don't vary that much, even for a complex network like this. So it goes back to how much stochasticity is in the simulation model, and you'd think there's a lot, but it turns out in reality for such a large network, it really doesn't make that huge difference. Okay, these are some of the initial simulation results. Just shows vehicle miles traveled, vehicle hours, the speeds in the network, freeways and arterials by different times of day. VMT and vehicle hours are greatest in the morning, lowest midday, speeds are highest midday. We simulated about 2 million vehicles, and of those vehicles, about 40,000 of them were trucks. Now, this is in that whole network from the ports to LA, about 10 miles wide, 20 miles long. This number is a big number. It goes back to, you guys are planning students, right? You know about 4-step planning process? Forecasting, okay. And you know some of the shortcomings of the 4-step forecasting process. So these are unlinked trips. So if you have one truck going from zone A to zone B, then it goes from zone B to zone C, zone C to zone D, that's 3 trips in a model like this. It's one truck, but it's 3 trips. That's why these are actually trips. It's not unique trucks. It's something like, at this time, there was something like 10,000 trucks, I think, serving the ports. So, because we use a microscopic simulation model, we needed to use a microscopic emissions model that would be sensitive to accelerations and decelerations. There's not a lot of choices. There's a CMEM model that Professor Matt Barth at Riverside has developed, but it doesn't address PM. And so at the time we did this, the EPA came out with the MOVES model, and we were one of the first, naively became one of the first users of the MOVES model. And basically, there was very little documentation for it. It's a very big, complex model, and we spent an awful lot of time figuring out how to get it running, which usually meant calling some guy in EPA in DC to ask questions, and he was very helpful. But we got it working, and we needed the distribution of truck ages. I'm not sure if it shows up that well, but the green here is 2012, which has the highest frequencies over here in terms of ages. And this is a reflection of the Clean Trucks program kicking out all the old trucks in 2012 and just having the newer trucks. Okay, these graphs show the percentage reductions of emissions compared to the 2005 baseline. First of all, for all vehicles in the network, so this includes non-port vehicles, passenger cars and others that are using the freeways and the roads. And then on the right-hand side, just for the port trucks. So these are the different pollutants that were examined that came out of moves: carbon monoxide, hydrocarbons, NOx, PM 2.5, PM 10. Most of the diesel PM is 2.5. There's usually very little difference between PM 10 and PM 2.5. So considering the whole system, these are huge reductions, certainly for PM. In the whole corridor, there's something like 55% reduction due to the full implementation of clean trucks and clean locomotives and cleaner activities in the rail yards too. And the reason largely for that is when you look at just port trucks, you can see over here that the reduction in PM is something like 97%. So the Clean Trucks program, or the cleanliness of the trucks in the Clean Trucks program in terms of PM, is really pretty phenomenal. It's like a 97% reduction. Now, they were pretty dirty to begin with, so, but that's a huge reduction. Okay, just to prove the point to ourselves as well as to others, we compared microscopic emissions versus macroscopic emissions because we made a big deal about having to use a microscopic emissions model. And this shows basically that there is a very big difference between micro and macro for the different pollutants. And the differences are much greater for arterials, as you might expect, excuse me, because of the stop and go traffic at traffic signals and so on. And basically emissions with a macro approach are really significantly underestimated. And so we think this is validation for using that microscopic approach. I haven't said too much about rail emissions to this point, except I did allude to the fact that there's not very much data, and that's really why I haven't said a lot about rail emissions, because what we were forced to do on the rail side was much more straightforward, much simpler than on the traffic side, and there's a lot of assumptions. Mana Sankapichai did a dissertation that addressed a number of these issues, and so the initial line haul emissions were based, for the baseline, on his work in 2009, and that split the Alameda corridor into 3 segments. And for those segments, I'm not sure if you can actually see these numbers, but you can get a copy of the presentation later. In these segments, the speed limits vary, and on locomotives, I didn't know this until we started, but locomotives have so-called notches, where they push a lever that goes into a different notch, like 1, 2, 3, 4, something like that. And those notches make the locomotive operate at a different speed, essentially. And so one needs to know what the notch settings are. And so we had to make assumptions for notch settings and speeds in these segments. We assumed there were 2 trains each hour with 4 locomotives, which is kind of typical. And we could estimate the line haul emissions from that using EPA emission rates. For the 2010-12 strategies, we extended this, or Mana's work, based again on EPA rates and the Tier 1, Tier 2 locomotive specs. And so this is not really a simulation. This is really a relatively straightforward analysis, and we think it does a reasonable job, but it's a lot less sophisticated than on the traffic side. We also looked at rail yards, without getting into the details. ARB has done some studies of rail yards in the corridor and looked at emissions, and the way we addressed it was to base emissions on an area basis, area of the rail yard, and with appropriate reductions for 2010 and 2012. And if you're interested in the rates, they're here, and they'll be in the presentation you can receive later. Okay, so ultimately, this led us to these combined emission results for the trucks, rail, including rail yards, and total for these three strategies, the baseline, 2010, 2012. Port trucks, if you say look at 2012, PM 97% reduction, NOx 86% reduction, rail substantial reductions, but you look at the original numbers here, port trucks had much, much higher total emissions. These units are kilograms, I believe, for these two pollutants compared with rail. But after the Clean Trucks program, you find that actually, even with the improvements in rail, that the emissions total from rail, you can't really add these together, but just to get a sense of it, these are actually about twice the number from trucks. So the situation is actually reversed from 2005 based on implementation of Clean Trucks. And total, about 84% reduction for PM and 70% for NOx. So these are huge reductions, partly due to rail, but very largely due to the Clean Trucks. We wanted to look at the dispersion. Those are just emissions. Those emissions are then, due to meteorological conditions, dispersed through the whole corridor, right? And so you need a dispersion model for that, and we chose a model called CalPUF. Why did we choose that? Well, it's a non-steady state model. It considers dynamic wind speed and direction, and you can actually buy data files that, for this region, actually for LA, have this meteorological data by season for 2005, and it can estimate the dispersion of NOx and PM. So it's a very powerful model, and this is one of the EPA recommended models. We assumed that daily emissions were constant each day, but the meteorological conditions changed. So we did the emissions for 4 months. You have to divide up your emitting sources, like freeways and arterials, into area sources that generate the emissions that then the model disperses. And so we had 77 area sources, and the input data were these emissions, the meteorological data, which is primarily wind speed and direction. And then you have all these points over the corridor that have emissions. You take 24-hour averages of those, and then if you choose the maximums, just for a matter of interest, these were what the maximums were over those seasons for baseline 2010 and 2012. And you can see some significant changes here, 2012 in particular. This is really for interest's sake. California does have an air quality standard, 50 micrograms per cubic meter for PM. These values were less than that. Previous studies we had done just of the 710 by itself showed that adjacent to the 710 that some of these standards were approached or exceeded. But in terms of dispersion across the whole corridor, interestingly enough, this standard was not exceeded, and yet our results still show that a lot of people are dying from these levels of pollution. These plots show the average daily PM concentration in the fall for each scenario. So we've got the baseline 2005, then 2010, 2012. So PM concentrations for each scenario. And the baseline, I'm not sure how well the colors show up back there, but these colors, there's a scale here, the legend. I'm sorry, I can barely even read it myself, but the red is the worst, so the worst one is up around the Commerce Yard. There's one close to ICTF here and close to the ports in here. You can see that the worst concentrations of PM are basically up to 710 into the Commerce Yard. There's a couple here on the 110. Fortunately, up here at USC, we're not doing too badly. So, and in 2010, you see the reductions taking effect, and then in 2012, there's one up here near Commerce. The arrows here, if you can see, are the dominant wind direction, which is why sometimes these concentrations are not dead over the top of where you think ICTF is or where the Commerce Yard is, because it's a combination of these pollutants being dispersed according to meteorological conditions in the corridor. So there's great improvement. Right here is around the 405, 710, and there's some really, or in relatively intense concentrations here. In 2012, they seem as if they're mostly gone. In fact, I think they are mostly gone. So tremendous improvement in PM. NOx, the patterns are similar to PM with the highest concentrations for 2012 remaining around Commerce and ICTF around this region, but still much, much improved compared with the baseline. Those plots showed concentrations. When you've got concentrations, you can use a model, or one of several, but this is an EPA model, BENMAP, to try to get a handle on the health impacts, because those changing concentrations have impacts on people's health. Now, I'm by no means an expert in that area, and even those who are experts have told me that it's a very difficult thing to model, because you have concentrations, say, outside this building, and which may be modeled through what we've done here. We're inside the building, or we're inside our home. How much of that are we actually breathing? So, you know, are we assuming that people are outside? Are they inside? And all that sort of thing. So it's quite difficult. So we've just basically used the impact functions that were in BENMAP that the feds provided. And BENMAP is a GIS-based program, and it has these health impact functions, for example, mortality, to estimate the monetary changes associated with those changes in pollutant concentrations as a result of the different strategies, like the Clean Trucks program and the clean locomotives, and so forth. The input data were local concentrations of pollutants at the block level, census block level. The health impact functions for PM were mortality and chronic bronchitis. For NOx were asthma. So these are the types of health impacts that monetary values are being estimated for. For PM impacts, there are no, or at the time there were no impact functions for people less than 30 years of age, and particularly for children. So there were two classes, as I recall, we'll see in a second, ages 30 to 65 and 65 and above. So we're capturing the effects on seniors, if you will, but not the effects on children and young adults, and so these results may be actually underestimated. Okay, so this table presents the asthma results for NOx in millions of dollars, and these are the categories that BENMAP utilizes. This is done by season for the two strategies. So this is baseline versus 2010, baseline versus 2012. When you add these up at the end here, there are health benefits, if you will, in terms of avoided asthma of roughly $61 million for 2010, $64 million for the 2012 strategy. So this is NOx in terms of asthma-related avoidance. For PM, we've got these two categories, as I said, for mortality from PM. Now, this is actually mortality avoided, so this is benefit, dollar benefit from mortality avoided. 30 to 65, 65 plus, chronic bronchitis by season, and these are, what's in the table are dollar values. The value of a human life, according to the EPA, is $6.8 million. So for the 2010 strategy, PM alone is $499 million, and 2012 is $563 million. The spatial distribution of benefits for asthma, this is asthma avoidance due to NOx, are shown here for one subset. It's the case of one or more symptoms. And it shows where the concentration, if you will, of asthma avoidance occurred, where the benefits occurred. And so you can see, if you say, look at the 2012, very much along, in terms of asthma avoidance, the benefits along 710, also around the 405 actually, and close to ICTF. You probably can't see too well from back there, but these little boxes with flags are elementary schools. And if you can take a closer look at this later, you'll see that a number of these maximum avoidance areas are either right on or very close to elementary schools. Now, I can't say anything conclusive about that because this is based on residents, but if these children are living close to their schools, I think it's at least interesting, if not more important than that, that these reductions are where there's a number of elementary schools. Mortality, people aged 65 or over, avoided mortality from PM. This is kind of interesting, I think, because it's different from the asthma reduction because it shows it's mostly in the southern section of the corridor. In fact, if you look at the 2012 strategy, full clean trucks, it's largely south of the 91, with a concentration along the 710, the 405, and even the 110. And the 710 tends to carry a lot more port trucks than the 110 does. But there's quite a concentration right along the freeways, but also up around ICTF and the 91, and up around Commerce to some degree, and the 710 up in that region, but particularly in the southern section. Let me just touch on this. It's really something we're just beginning on. Kate Hyun, current PhD student, is working on this. There's a huge amount of data that gets generated by this sort of analysis, as you can see from those previous plots. So we're trying to see if there's anything that makes sense in terms of environmental justice. This is an EPA definition for environmental justice. On the left here, we have distribution at block level, I believe, of Hispanics. On the right, white. And there's quite a difference in terms of the concentration. These are numbers of residents. It's not density, it's numbers of people. So there's a concentration of Hispanics right around the ports, and then north of the 91, in LA, between, say, the 91 and the Commerce Yard, there's big concentrations, those two areas. Not so much for whites in the corridor. So there's rather a difference in the distribution there between Hispanics and whites. If you look at the monetary benefits by race and ethnicity, these are census definitions. So white, African American, Asian race groups that the census uses. Hispanic is an ethnicity group that the census uses. And for population, still, now this is actually one of the problems with this analysis at this point. This is LA County, it's not just the corridor, it's why these numbers are so huge. For LA County, in numbers, whites are greater than Asians, greater than African Americans. The monetary benefits by race are white, African American, Asian, which you can look or see from this table. By ethnicity, population slightly greater for non-Hispanic, but monetary benefit by ethnicity group, Hispanic is much greater for the 2012 strategy. It's 62%, I think it was, down here. So it's just a preliminary result and something we're going to look at more carefully. So let me try to sum up. I've presented a lot of data and a lot of pictures, and I know it's hard to assimilate all of this. I think one of the main contributions is here that there's a combination of tools that's been developed, really for the first time, to enable a detailed quantification of the magnitude of some of the social costs. There's many other social costs. We're just talking about some of them, and some of those related to health impacts from air quality changes in the corridor. This is landside freight transportation, so it's outside the port gates. We're not including activities within the port, moving containers within the port. We're not including ships discharging, pollutants while they're say out in the bay waiting to berth or waiting to take off, burning dirty bunker fuel or that sort of thing. There have been some other studies of that. We're really talking about landside outside the port gates. Vehicle emissions and rail emissions are estimated at a microscopic level, and we tend to focus on NOx and PM. We looked at line haul and rail yard emissions, and not unexpectedly, scenario 2012 was the best one. In terms of dispersion, spring actually turned out to be best and fall was worst. Social benefits in terms of pollution reductions for scenario 2010 totaled some $560 million. And for full clean trucks with Tier 3 locomotives, rail yard improvements, some $627 million. In terms of ethnicity, Hispanics received a greater share of the social benefits for the 2012 scenario. And I think an interesting one could probably be argued, but the social benefits, if you just look at PM reduction alone and port trucks alone, not even rail, under 2012, the benefits were about $440 million. I didn't report that number in the presentation, but it was about $440 million. So to us, this suggested that the cost of replacing drayage trucks under the Clean Trucks program, which I believe was the Port of LA, I saw a report saying that they estimated the total investment to be about $1 billion. That in a benefit cost balance, that it seems to be worth it, because 2.5 years you're basically recouping those costs. And so we would assert that the program seems that it was successful and probably exceeded its target. Now, of course, there's an equity issue involved in that. Future research, as I said, we're going to be looking at environmental justice issues to a greater degree, looking at other scenarios. We've looked at moving containers from truck to rail and the impacts that that has in terms of changing mode split for freight traffic in the corridor. The microscopic simulation is extraordinarily time-consuming. We're looking at so-called mesoscopic or hybrid models to apply the same kind of framework to the east-west corridor that's under discussion and development right now. So I guess that's it. So thank you very much for your time.
Question time.
Yes, sir.
Professor, a question regarding the Clean Truck program. How was that, or how is the program marketed, and what happens to the trucks that are taken off of the road, the ones that are replaced by the clean trucks?
Jen is probably a bigger expert on clean trucks. I don't claim to be an expert. It was mandated, so they could not enter the ports if they didn't meet the criteria for whatever they were for 2000. It started in 2008, then 2010 there were different stages. So it was a mandate. The ports agreed, and they had to have tags on them, and so it was really a mandate. What happened to the dirty trucks? I don't know. I've heard stories that some people think that some individuals have a clean truck, they enter the port, pick up a container, get outside the port area, switch it to a dirty truck, and continue on with a dirty truck, an old truck. I don't know. There's a difference between the natural gas and the clean diesel ones too, because the natural gas ones don't have the same number of refueling stations or opportunities, so they tend to go to somewhat shorter distances. So there are differences in the operations of the fleet. But basically, I think to answer the first part of your question, there was a mandated program. They had no choice. So,
Thank you.
Yes?
So, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, either MOVES or CalPUF doesn't take into consideration of real-time air pollution data.
Yeah.
So, like, given that these programs are put in practice right now, you can actually see monitor the changes in real time. Supposedly because there are a lot of monitoring stations.
Yes.
Has there been any effort to do a reality check on your model?
That's a really good point, and I also thought of that a long time ago, but it just got lost in the shuffle somewhere. We should do that. The problem, one of the difficulties of doing that, though, is yes, there are these monitoring stations, and I think you can even get readings online from them. They're distributed throughout the corridor, but of course they're picking up everything that's there. If there's some coal-fired plant or there's some other polluter or whatever, they're picking up contributions from everything. So then how do you separate that out and say this much is just due to the port trucks or this much is due to the locomotives? That was the issue we started to grapple with and truthfully gave up on. So, but it's an excellent point. It'd be a desirable thing to do because, yeah, we don't know how accurate all this is. There's a question over here somewhere, I think. Oh.
Two questions.
Okay.
Did you look at all in terms of like the tonnage per emissions? Because of like the rail, you show that they do emit a lot more even after the clean truck program. But then if you look at the tonnage, like what's causing the worst damage per ton that they're hauling then? Did you account for that?
Yeah, no, we haven't done that. We were looking at, I mean, that's something else that could be done. It could probably be done fairly readily, I think, with the data that we have, because we've got the emissions. We know, we've made assumptions about trains and what's on them in terms of numbers of locomotives and sizes of the trains. So you'd probably find out that per ton rail was a lower emitter. We were just looking at totals and then the effect on concentrations as it affected public health. So.
Also, have you hypothesized at all, I guess, about what the Southern California International Gateway would maybe have effect on? Since you've been looking at emissions, do you think that would make it a lot worse for the people overall in the greater Los Angeles area?
That I don't know. I'm not actually sure what you're referring to. I've heard it, but I don't really know what it is. When you say Southern California Gateway.
Another
a near-dock rail.
Oh, okay.
It'll be right next to the existing ICTF down there.
We're actually in the process of modeling more near-dock rail. I guess it's the same thing. Yeah, we're looking at mode shift, and there are some physical constraints and probably additional investment that's required for some of that. But you can examine that with these models. You can look at mode shifts so that one could predict what the impacts would be. We've done a little bit of that, and we're doing more. So. Yes?
A question about environmental justice. Why you calculate the environmental justice based on the race group, other than other category of group like income or education or anything?
Because that's all that was available to us. That's the way the census defines it. I think it's from the block level, and so some here may know better than I do, and we're just at the beginning stage of this, but a lot of the time if you want to get really detailed census information, it'll take a year or two to get approval, and then you have to go to a census office to actually get the data and sign non-disclosure agreements and so on. So these were the data that were most readily available, and that's the way essentially they presented it. It's not like we chose to focus on just those groups, that's just what was there. Yes?
The 440 million per year savings, how does that factor in the costs of basically the health impacts that were avoided, and more specifically related to like the idea of quantifying the value of like a human life, and how do you amortize that? Like how do you I mean, that, hopefully this doesn't sound too cold, but I'm just wondering, like, I'm assuming the value of human life has to do with, like, earning capacity and so forth, like, over their lifespan, so.
I think so, yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, is that, so then that per year cost really is bundling that all in, or?
Yes, yeah. This was based on basically a 1-year period. That's why I'm saying it's 440 per year. So, and a lot of that is mortality avoided, which goes back to $6.8 million per human life. You know, it's similar to evaluation of transportation schemes that save tiny amounts of time to a lot of people, and you apply a value of time and you come up with this huge number. And actually, I'm not suggesting that's the case here, because what is the value of human life? We could argue about that all day, right? But actuaries and analysts come up with a number, and that's the EPA number, 6.8. And it is buried in there, and a lot of that is actually mortality avoided. Now, if you argue it should be 3.4 million, that number goes down by a large amount. If you say life is priceless, it should be 100 million, the number goes up, right?
Do you know how many lives are associated with that number?
I did have that. It's not here, but I just mentally back calculated. I think it's about 75 a year.
And I think to the point here, she's asking also, it's sort of, it's a lump sum 6.8 million savings if you don't die this year. And so if you die next year, right? So
yeah.
Basically, instead of sort of amortizing it over, you know, the representation of that 6.8 million is the lost years and the sadness of relatives and so on and so forth. So in answer to your question, yes, it's a very gross approximation. It's a one-shot count instead of an amortization.
Well, I don't know. I'm pretty sure it does not include things like the grief and heartache and all those things, you know, impacting families. It's okay, one person dies. And
but that's the 6.8 million. That's
yeah,
how they get the number.
Yeah, right.
You know, part of it is your lost earnings, part of it is your lost time with your loved ones, etc. But that's quantified.
So it's cold, right? But it's
Any other questions? One last question.
Has there been a new study which confirms that the number of deaths due to these respiratory diseases have actually come down since the implementation of the CTP?
Not to my knowledge. There maybe has. The 2012 obviously is very recent, and with respect to the Tier 3 locomotives, they're not actually all fully implemented now. The clean trucks part was January 1st, I think, this year, for the final version of the clean trucks program. The locomotive part hasn't been implemented, so it's probably too soon. Someone may have done studies over the last couple of years, sort of interim, but I'm not aware of them. But that would be a really interesting thing, and hopefully would show the same or greater benefit.
Okay, I think we can give a round of applause for